Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Pei Aleph is divided neatly in half by a Mishnah. The Daf begins right after a Mishnah which concluded the previous Daf. So the first half of our Daf will be discussing the Mishnah. We'll be first trying to figure out why this Mishnah seems to repeat halacha that it said before. We'll have two explanations for that, and then we'll discuss the halacha of using a whole loaf of bread to make an Erev Chatzeres or a Shetufei Mevais, different types of bread that can be used, and how you define a whole loaf, when it's called Shalem and when is it not called Shalem. After that, we'll get to the next Mishnah, the Mishnah on the Daf, and that'll tell us about halachos of Zechus and how you make a kinyan on bread in order to be used as an Erev Chatzeres or Shetufei Mevais. Okay, so we had seen in the Mishnah which closed off the previous Daf that there's a machlekes what you're allowed to use for Shetufei Mevais and Erev Chatzeres. According to Rabbi Elazar, you're allowed to use anything except for water and salt. According to Rabbi Shua, it has to be a whole bread. That's, he argues on two things. First of all, he says it has to be bread, and second of all, the bread has to be whole. So the Gemara says, in Rabbi Elazar's halacha, the Tana Kama, that you're allowed to use anything, we already saw that. We had a halacha way back on a Daf Chavav. We had a Mishnah that said clearly that you're allowed to use any type of food except for water and salt in order to make an Erev Techumen. That's Erev Techumen. This is Erev Chatzeres. What's the difference? So the Gemara says, no, there is a difference. The difference is that Rabbi Yeshua argues on Erev Chatzeres here, and therefore I needed to say this Mishnah to show that Rabbi Elazar does not agree to Rabbi Yeshua. I would have thought that he does. Now, Rabbi Shua doesn't argue that you can use anything for Eruvin Tchumen, because there's no problem there that different people are joining together and one may bring something more valuable and then they'll start a fight over who brought what. That's not going to happen. Erev Tchumen, only one person is bringing on. Erev Chatzeres, you have a number of people bringing together, you have a potential concern that people are going to argue over who brought what, and therefore Rabbi Shua says everybody has to bring the same thing, everybody has to bring bread. That way you won't have an issue. So Gemara says, the problem with this pshat is that it's not necessarily true that Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah is saying you're allowed to use other things besides for bread. What do you mean? He clearly says you could use anything. So Abai says when he says you could use anything, he might mean any different type of bread, which is the same as Rabbi Shua, and therefore there's no machlekes, and that could not be the explanation of why our Mishnah was repeated, to emphasize this machlekes. There is no machlekes. Everybody really agrees that you have to use bread. The only thing Rabbi Elazar was saying is that you could use any type of bread, and Rabbi Shua doesn't argue on that either. Now, why would I say such a pshat? So Abai says, I'll show you a brayso. So you have to say that pshat. The brayso says a contradictory expression. It says you're allowed to make a Erev Chatzeres with anything, and a Shetufei Mevais with anything, but in Erev Chatzeres you have to use bread. So what does that mean? You're allowed to use bread or you're not allowed to use bread? You said you have to, you're allowed to use other things, or you're not. You started off saying you're allowed to use anything, and after it said only bread for an Erev Chatzeres. So the way we explain it is that when you say you're allowed to use anything, we mean any type of bread. That's the only way to fit this Mishnah in. So you could say the same thing for Rabbi Elazar in our Mishnah, and then there's no machlekes. So the Gemara therefore now moves on to a second new explanation of why we had to repeat our Mishnah. It's a slight revision to the old one. And it's Rabbi Bar Bachana, who says that the reason why we were saying this was to show that we're arguing on Rabbi Yeshua again, but not from the fact they have to use bread, because it could be that everybody really agrees they have to use bread, but Rabbi Yeshua said it has to be whole. So we're disagreeing with that. We're saying that it does not necessarily have to be whole bread. Now, I think Gemara explains that the reason why you need whole bread is that the reason why you have to have bread and then it should be whole bread is that people shouldn't fight over who brought something more expensive. So Gemara says, what if everybody brings a slice of bread? So then they won't fight about that either. The Gemara says, no, we're afraid that it may still come to a situation where people will end up bringing whole, and therefore, some people will bring whole and some will bring slice, and therefore we say, no, everybody should bring whole. It's the only way to avoid the fight, to have a general rule. Everybody always has to bring a whole piece of bread, a whole loaf of bread. Okay, now how much can be missing and it's still called whole? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Shaul says, if it's missing the size that you would take off when you take challah from something, that's not a problem. And if it's missing the size that you have to take off when you get some truma mixed in there, the halach is when you get truma mixed into your bread, So you have to take off something and use that for truma. Assuming that the truma is batal, you do have to take off 1/100th of it and use it for truma, just so that the kahanim shouldn't lose out. So if you take off that amount, so that's also still good. The Gemara asks, how can you say that challah is fine if it's missing the amount for a challah? We have another brisa that clearly says if it's missing the amount that you would take off for a challah, you cannot use that for an Erev Chatzeres. Gemara says not a kasher. There's two different shiurim for challah. Somebody who's making bread in order to sell it has to take off 1/48th. Somebody who's making bread to keep for himself has to take off 1/24th. So the larger size is a problem. The smaller size is not a problem. Okay, now the Gemara goes further and says if a piece fell off and you stick it back on by attaching it with a toothpick, that's fine. The Gemara says, how can you say that's fine? The Brisa says it's not okay. The Gemara says if you can't see the seam, then it's fine, and if it's very obvious and it looks bad, then it's no good. Okay, says the Gemara further. Rabbi Zeir says in the name of Shmuel, you're allowed to use bread made from rice, or bread made from corn, or millet, other types of grains. Mar Ukva says, my version of Shmuel's halach here is that you're allowed to use bread made from rice, but not bread made from corn or millet. Rav Chia bar Avin says in the name of Rav, you're allowed to use bread made from lentils. Rav says, how could you say that? It was an incident that happened in the days of Shmuel. They made bread made out of lentils, and Shmuel threw it to a dog. He said, this is not edible. Not only that, the dog refused to eat it. So you see that bread made out of lentils is not food. So Rav says, no, that bread that Shmuel threw was made out of a mix of different grains. It wasn't pure lentil bread. And it's just like the bread that's mentioned in Sefer Yecheskel, when Yecheskel was given a job to make a disgusting bread that was not inedible and to eat it in front of the Am as part of his nevuah. So he was told to make bread made out of beans, adashim, millet, oats, all these things together. So when you mix together a lot of different things, it doesn't taste good, it's not edible, and that's what was thrown, that's what Shmuel threw to the dog that he refused to eat. If it would be just lentils, that would be fine. Rav Papa says, actually, in the case of Yecheskel, the bread was baked by roasting it over a fire fueled by human feces. So maybe that's what happened over here with Shmuel also. It was really disgusting, but it's nothing to do with Adashim. On the subject, the Gemara explains another phrase in the Pasuk in Sefer Yecheskel, which calls this bread ugas sa'orim, a cake of barley. The Gemara says it wasn't made out of barley, it was made out of a mix of grains. Why is it called barley? The Gemara says sa'orim should be read shi'urim, meaning to say that you should eat it in the same way that people would eat something when it's a famine year and they're starving and they're hungry. They eat it ravenously. And he was told to eat this disgusting thing. He's told to eat it that way. Rav Papa says the meaning is that it should look like sa'irim and not like chitim, meaning it should have a horrible look, not only a horrible taste and composition, it should also look horrible. That was part of the nevuah. Okay, but now we get to the next Mishnah. By way of introduction, let's keep in mind that the Eruv has to belong to all the people who live in the Chatzer. And there are two ways to do that. You could either have each of them contribute towards the purchase of an amount of food, or you could have one person be mizakeh to everybody, that's transfer ownership to everybody all at once. Now here you have a situation in which somebody wanted to join a kinyan, to purchase it together with the group, but he ends up needing to rely on zechus, and the question is if that works. So the situation is interesting. You have somebody, one of the residents of the yard is actually a dealer in food. He either is a store owner or he's a baker and he sells the food. So that person could do both things. He could sell some, let's say, bread to everybody who lives in the Chatzer, or he could actually be mizakeh to everybody because he's a dealer, he has his own. Now, somebody came to him, one of the other members of the Chatzer, and he gave him money, and he said, here's money, with this I wish to purchase part of the bread that you're going to end up giving everybody else when they come to buy, so I'm giving you the money from my chelik. For my share, they'll come to you with money from everyone else, I'm giving you mine. And here it should now belong to me with this money that I'm giving to you. Now the halacha is that mid'oraisa, when you give somebody money to buy something from him, it now belongs to you. The Rabbanon made a gzeira, and they said that shouldn't happen, because what's going to end up happening is that once the guy sold it, now it's your responsibility, but it's in his house, so he's not going to take care of it, and it's going to end up getting destroyed, and he won't care. So therefore, the Rabbanon said that money does not work. In order for something to transfer from the possession of the seller to the buyer, the transfer of title has to be when you actually pick it up and you take it to yourself. Money doesn't do anything. So here a guy came and he gave the store owner money, and he said, here's money in order that I should buy my share. And that doesn't work, because Midrabanan, they said that that's not good enough because of this rule. And then what later happened was that guy went and he was mezakeh everybody. So Rabbi Eliezer says it's good, and the Chachamim say it's no good. Why? Rabbi Eliezer says he went and he was mezakeh. He could be mezakeh this guy just as everyone else. So Chachamim say no. He intended to buy it. By intending to buy it, he revealed that he doesn't want to be a part of the zechus. He rejected the zechus to him, and therefore it's not a zechus to him, and therefore it doesn't belong to him. Now, if it would be somebody else, somebody who's not an owner, just a regular guy, so then, even if he gives him the money, we assume that he's okay with his zechus. That's because the guy's not a seller. He doesn't deal in things. We don't assume that he bought it. It could be that he just took the money, that the guy should be a shliach for him. He should be his messenger to pay for his share in the bread. So that's fine if he was mazaketim, so he's okay with that also. He didn't think that he was kind of with the money. So again, the difference between the store owner and a regular person is that the store owner sells it. And therefore somebody gives him money, we assume he gave him money in order to purchase from him. Once you do that, zechus doesn't work for you, because you've shown that you want it to be purchased and not to be zechus, and therefore the zechus doesn't work for you. And the Chachamim sum up their opinion and say, because you cannot be mizakeh something to somebody against his will or without him knowing about it, unless it's for his benefit. And here he showed that he wants something else. Now Rabbi Yehuda adds a interesting comment. He says, "Bamed v'amamum." When is that true? That's true by Eruvin Tchumen, because you can't make an Erev Tchumen for somebody without his will, because he may not want your Tchum. Let's say you make the Erev Tchum to extend on the east, you're extending his Tchum to the east, but you are losing Tchum for him for the west, and maybe he wants to go west. So you can't do that without permission, because you don't know if it's a schus of him. But in Erev Chatzeris, it's for sure a schus, and therefore it's good, you can do it for him, not a problem. We've seen the Gemara discuss earlier whether Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on the Chachamim or he is explaining the Chachamim. The Gemara will discuss that again later on here as well. Okay, now the Gemara begins. And first of all, the Gemara wonders what could be pshat in Rabbi Eliezer. How could he hold that by giving money it makes the person kaina the eruv? Well, you can't be kaina something by just giving money. The Chachamim said that doesn't work. The Chachamim say you have to actually lift it up. So the Gemara answers that there's a special dispensation that the Chachamim made l'kavod yontif, that money should work, and that applies here also for Shabbos as well. L'kavod Shabbos, money should work, and that's what Rabbi Eliezer holds. Now the Gemara quotes that source in full. The source is as follows. It says that there are 4 times of the year in which money, if somebody buys meat, somebody gives a coin to buy meat from the butcher, the meat is already his, just by transferring the money. And therefore if something happens to it, it's his responsibility. But on the same token, if the butcher doesn't have anybody else to buy any of the meat, he still has to slaughter an entire cow just to give this guy his meat, because he already owns it. So, what are the 4 times of the year? They are Erev Yantif, Erev Pesach, Erev Shavuos, Erev Rosh Hashanah, and Erev Shmini Atzeres. Now, the Gemara says, what could be the reason here? Why does this coin work? Only these times and not other times. It can't be that it's with Mashiach or without Mashiach, because then why does it only work sometimes and not other times? So the rest is the reason. The Gemara gives 2 potential reasons. The first reason is Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzchak, who says that it was a zechus. Somebody was mezakeh him. It wasn't that he gave a coin, somebody was mezakeh him. And these 4 times is considered to be for his benefit, and therefore this chus works. and the other times of the year it's not considered to be his benefit, and this chus does not work. These 4 times, because it's very high demand for meat, it's considered a chus. Now Rabbi Yochanan says, because these 4 times, because of the high demand, Chazal went back to the rule d'oraisa that the transferring of money does acquire the property l'kavod yontif, and therefore we are relying on that here also l'kavod Shabbos. Okay, now we move on to the next phrase in the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that if it was other people, then it is okay, the zechus works. Only if it's a store owner, it doesn't work. So the Gemara explains a few halachas here. Shmuel says other people means anybody besides for a store owner, any baal bayis. When we said that zechus doesn't work for the baal bayis, that's only if he gave him money. But if he does chalipin, that is, he gives him a kli and says, you take this kli, and in exchange, I'll take the bread belongs to me when you pick up this kli, that is a good halachic transfer, and that it does work. Also, the problem is only if he says zecheli, there it's not clear what he wants him to do, but if he says orevli, then he's clearly saying to him, take this money and make me part of the erev with it, and he's saying, be my shliach, and buy the erev for me. He's not trying to buy it. He's not trying to use the money that he's giving him to buy directly from him. He's giving him the money as a messenger to buy on his behalf, and therefore it certainly does work. Okay, going further, Rabbi Yehuda says, Bamedvar Mamurim. Meaning Rabbi Yehuda says that Zechus doesn't work for an Erev Tchumen, but it does work for an Erev Chatzeros. So Gemara says, the Shmuel says, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. As a matter of fact, in Hilchos Eruvin, the halacha is always like Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav Chana Bagdata asked, is that always true? What about in the case of a mavoi, which lost one of its requirements on Shabbos? It lost its kaira, its crossbeam, or it lost its side post, its lechi on Shabbos. You're allowed to carry there further, since it was there in the beginning of Shabbos or not. And that's also machlekes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Do we pass on like Rabbi Yehuda there also, because it's about Eruvin? So the answer was given, it's not Eruvin. Eruvin means an Erev Chatzeris or an Erev Tchumen and things like that. That's about making walls. What considered a valid wall or not, that's technically not considered to be halacha of Eruvin. Gemara says, now hold on a second, you're saying that Shmuel Paskin halacha like Rabbi Yehuda, that means Rabbi Yehuda is arguing the Chachamim? But Rabbi Yehuda just said Bamed Varmamurim. He sounded like he's explaining the Chachamim. He's explaining the Chachamim when they said that you have to inform the person he can't be Mezakeh. That was only by Erev Tchumen, because he's losing some of his Tchum. But by Erev Chatzeres, the Chachamim agree. So it doesn't sound like there's a machlekes here. And then where it says, when Rabbi Shua ben Levi says a rule, whenever Rabbi Yehuda says Bamed Varmamurim, he's explaining, he's not arguing. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? We just said on the daf yesterday, on daf Pei, we proved that the Chachamim have to hold that you can't be Mezakeh, because they say that if you added on residents into the Chatzar and you have to join with them, then you have to inform them that we're making an error for you. You can't just be Mezakeh them without their knowledge. So you see that there is an opinion out there, which must be that Chachamim holds that Erev Chatzeres is not as Chos. So obviously Rabbi Yehuda is arguing. So Gemara says, no, that's different. That's talking about where it was 2 Chatzeres together, where it's 2 Chatzeres near each other. You don't necessarily need to make an Erev Chatzeres there. Over there, it's not necessarily as Chos. But if you have one, and everybody in it is going to be forbidden unless everybody joins, then it's definitely as Chos. So the Gemara says, what are you coming to tell me? The Gemara there clearly said that we learn from that case, from the case of the added residents, that the Chachamim argue on Rabbi Yehuda. So you want to have no, here it's as close, here it's not as close. The Gemara already proved from there that this is a source that there is a machlokes. So the Gemara says, so it's a machlokes amarayim, whether Rabbi Yehuda argues or he's just explaining. According to Shmuel, Rabbi Yehuda argues, and according to Rabbi Shua ben Levi, Rabbi Yehuda is just explaining.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.